Daenys Targaryen counted things. It was a habit her mother despaired of, and her father pretended not to notice. And it had begun so early in her life that she could not remember a time before it. She counted the steps of the Targaryen manse, 144 from the water gardens to the dragon terrace, if one did not skip. She counted the ships in the harbour of Valyria from the high windows of her father's library, though she always lost the tally somewhere past 400, because the harbour of Valyria did not end. It curved away around the headlands in both directions, quays of fused black stone, crowded with hulls from Yi Ti and Sarnor and the Summer Isles, from ports whose names she had only ever seen inked on charts, and by the time she had counted the ships at anchor, a dozen more had come in past the breakwater, and a dozen more had gone. She counted the towers too when she flew. That was the counting she loved best, and the counting she never finished. From the back of a dragon, the freehold of Valyria unrolled beneath her like something a god had made in a fever of pride. A city that was not a city at all, but 100 cities grown together, terraced up the flanks of the 14 flames, spilling down into valleys where the lands of the long summer began, green and gold and endless. The towers rose out of it like a forest of spears. Some were slender as needles, and taller than any work of man had a right to be. Spiraled things of dragon glass and fused stone that caught the light of the volcanoes at night and burned like candles. Some were squat and vast, whole palaces stacked upon palaces, their walls carved with sphinxes and heroes and dragons in such profusion that a girl could spend a year on a single wall and not learn all its faces. The stone mages had raised them in the centuries when Valyria was young, singing the rock into shapes no chisel could make, and the towers had stood for so long that no one in the freehold thought of them as things that had been built. They simply were, the way the mountains were, the way the sea was. Above them, always, there were dragons. Daenys had tried to count those exactly once, on the day of the games that closed the Festival of the Flames, when every dragon lord in the freehold took to the sky at the sounding of the great horns. She had reached 300 before the beasts began to wheel and cross and braid themselves into rivers of wings, gold over green, over red, over shadow black, and the count had dissolved into pure astonishment. Her brother Gaemon had laughed at her afterward.
You cannot count a storm, little sister.
And she had wanted to be annoyed with him, and found she couldn't be, because he was right, and because Gaemon's laughter was a thing it was very hard to stand apart from. That was Valyria in the last years, a storm that no one thought to count because no one believed it could ever end. She was 6 and 10 the year the world began, very quietly, to die, and she knew none of it yet. What she knew was this, that she was the second child and only daughter of Lord Enar of House Targaryen, that her house was old and proud and, though no one said it in her hearing, small, that her hair was the pale silver gold of the dragon lords, and her eyes were violet, and that these things marked her in the streets of the freehold as one of the blood, one of the 40 families, one of those before whom even the magisters of Volantis bowed. What she knew was the smell of her mother's terrace garden in the evening, lemon trees and fire poppies and the sulphur tang that lay under everything in Valyria, so constant that one only noticed it upon returning from the sea. What she knew was her father's library, and the great harbour, and the sound, felt more than heard, a tremor in the bones of the earth, in the floors, in the water of her washing basin, of the 14 flames breathing in their sleep. Everyone in Valyria knew that sound. It was the first sound they heard in the cradle, and the last they heard in the dark. The mountains muttered, and the ground shivered, and now and then a plume of ash would stand up over one of the peaks like a grey feather in a helm, and the people of the freehold would glance at it and go on about their business, because the 14 flames had muttered and shivered and smoked for 5,000 years, and Valyria had only grown greater. The Valyrians had a saying about it, old as the first roads. The mountains gave us the dragons. The mountains will not take them back. Daenys had believed it, just as everyone believed it, which is to say, she had never once thought about it at all. The manse of House Targaryen stood on the seaward slope of the third hill of the old city, which told anyone who understood Valyria everything they needed to know about House Targaryen. The first hill belonged to the great families, the ones whose names were spoken like weather, whose dragons were the size of war galleys, who held whole subject cities in the lands of the long summer and whole nations of slaves beneath the mountains. Their palaces looked down on everything. The second hill belonged to the families who contested with them, generation by generation, in the endless, slow war of marriages and trade compacts and duels above the anvil peaks that passed in the freehold for politics. The third hill belonged to houses like the Targaryens, dragon lords, yes, of the blood of the 40, entitled to sit in the assembly of the first families and to be heard there, but lesser, a house of one great manse and modest estates, of 5 dragons where the mighty counted their beasts in dozens, a house whose voice in the assembly was heard politely and weighed lightly. There had been prouder centuries, so the family histories insisted. Daenys had read them all, and privately concluded that every family's histories insisted the same thing. Her father never spoke of the third hill as a lesser place. But Daenys had watched Lord Enar all her life the way she watched everything, closely and quietly, and without appearing to, and she knew the shape of his ambition, the way she knew the cracks in her bedroom ceiling. She saw it in the care he took with every invitation, every cargo, every marriage rumour. She saw it in the way he stood in the assembly, never in the front rank, never in the back. Enar Targaryen was a man engaged in a work that had consumed his father and his father's father, the patient, unglamorous, generations-long labour of moving a house up a hill. He was not a warm man in company. In company he was polished and watchful and impossible to read, and Daenys had heard the lords of the greater houses describe him, not unkindly, as sound, which in the mouths of such men meant useful, careful, and no threat to anyone. But there was another Einar, one that perhaps only 3 people living had seen. That one came to the library on the nights when sleep would not, and found his daughter there with a lamp burning low over some crumbling account of the Giscari Wars, and instead of sending her to bed, sat down across the table and asked her what she was reading, and listened, actually listened, with the whole of his attention, which he gave to no magister and no rival and no friend, while she told him. Once, on such a night when she had finished, he studied her across the lamp.
You have your grandmother's mind. She read everything. She used to say the freehold was a beast that had forgotten it had a body, all head, all fire, and no notion of what its own feet were standing on.
What did she mean?
Einar smiled a little, a private smile.
I never knew. Neither did she, I think. But I have never forgotten it, and now neither will you, so perhaps that was the point.
Her mother, the Lady Valyria, was a different country altogether. Where Einar was still water, Valyria was current, quick and warm and sharp-tongued, a famous beauty in her youth who had brought 2 estates and an old bloodline into the marriage, and never let anyone forget either. It was Valyria who ruled the manse, Valyria who knew every whisper on 3 hills before it finished being whispered, Valyria who could reduce a household of 200 to perfect silent order with the lift of 1 eyebrow. She loved her children fiercely and expressed it chiefly through correction. Daenys's counting, her habit of silence in company, her preference for the library over the garden parties where the marriages of the freehold were actually made, all of it Valyria regarded as a problem to be managed, in the way a jeweller regards a flaw in an otherwise promising stone. She told Daenys so over and over in 100 variations.
You are a daughter of the dragon. You do not get to be a mystery. Mysteries are for the mighty. We are not mighty. We are interesting. And we survive by being interesting to the right people.
And then there was Gaiman. Gaiman was 2 years the elder, and he was everything the third hill was supposed to produce and mostly didn't. He was tall and golden, and gifted at every pursuit the freehold prized, the sword, the lance, the high tongue in its courtly forms, the ancient game of tiles that the old lords played for estates. He flew like he had been born in the air. Other houses' sons collected grudges. Gaiman collected friends, effortlessly in the manses of the first hill and the wine sinks of the harbour district alike, and he moved between those worlds without ever seeming to notice there was a border. The great families invited him to their hunts. Their daughters looked at him. Their fathers, more usefully, remembered his name. Valyria liked to tell Daenys plainly, and in her brother's hearing, that her brother was the finest work the family had produced in 4 generations, and the marvel of Gaemon was that it had not ruined him. He wore the praise the way he wore everything, lightly, and the person he came looking for at the end of every triumph, the person whose opinion he actually wanted, was his odd, quiet counting sister, who would tell him the truth. The summer he took the youth's laurel at the games, she considered him gravely amid the cheering.
They cheered you for a quarter of an hour. I counted.
Only a quarter?
You dipped your left wing on the last turn. If Vagon had been half a length faster, you'd have lost the inside line and the laurel with it. It was still beautiful.
Gaemon had laughed his great laugh and slung an arm around her and told the assembled flower of Valyrian youth that his sister was the only honest creature in the freehold, and someday they would all be sorry about it. Later, years later, on a black island at the far side of the world, Daenys would remember that afternoon in unbearable detail. The heat shimmer over the racing grounds, the smell of spiced wine and dragon, 12 young lords and ladies sprawled laughing on silk cushions in the light of the peaks, every one of them certain, with a certainty deeper than bone, that the world they had been born into was the world's final form. That history had laboured 14,000 years to produce Valyria, and having produced it was complete. Of the 12, she would be able to name at the end the 2 who lived. The dragons of House Targaryen were 5. There was Vagon, Gaemon's mount, bronze and swift, a racer's dragon, vain as his rider was not. There was Meraxes, who had carried Lord Enar for 30 years, dun gold and patient, a beast that flew the way Enar spoke, without one wasted motion. There was old Syrax the she-dragon, pale as morning, who had borne Daenys' grandmother and now suffered no rider at all. And there was Aerion the younger, a quarrelsome green who belonged in the loose way of such things to her uncle Demian. Then there was the Black Dread. He had no proper name yet the year Daenys turned 6 and 10. The family still called him the Black Hatchling, though he had long outgrown the word, and there was already something in him that made the dragon keepers careful. He had come out of his egg in the dark of a winter storm, larger than any hatchling the house's records remembered, and he had grown the way a rumour grows. He was black as the stone of the old roads, black to the wing membranes, black to the tongue. When he opened his mouth, the fire that lay down in him showed dull red, like a wound in the night. He did not play as young dragons play. He watched. He had claimed no rider and accepted no name, and the wise consensus of the household was that he would be Gaemon's second mount someday, when Vargon aged, because such a beast could belong to no one but the heir. The Black Hatchling had other opinions. He had begun, that year, to come to the low terrace in the evenings when Daenys sat there alone. Not near, dragons did not do near, not uninvited, but present on the far parapet, a piece of the darkness with 2 dim coals in it, watching the same sea she watched. The dragon keepers reported it to Lord Enar with some anxiety. Enar came and stood and observed his slight, silent, counting daughter at one end of the terrace and the largest hatchling in the annals of his house at the other, both of them gazing out at the water with identical expressions of ancient patience, and told the keepers to leave it be.
Dragons choose. It is the one matter in Valyria on which no lord has ever had a vote.
Daenys herself said nothing about it to anyone, but she had begun to bring a lamp to the terrace, and a book, and to read aloud, quietly, to no one, in the way of a girl who has always been most herself in the company of words. And the black would fold his wings and settle, and the coals of his eyes would half lid, and the tremor of the 14 flames would come up through the stone beneath them both like the pulse of some vast shared heart. She did not love him the way Gaemon loved Vagon, with whoops and wagers and mad low passes over the harbour that made the port masters send formal complaints. What she felt was stranger and quieter, and had no word in the high tongue that fit. It was the feeling of being recognised, as if something older than the house, older than the hill, had looked at the overlookable daughter of an overlookable family and seen, what? She didn't know. She was 6 and 10. She thought she had years to find out. She named him on an evening in early autumn, the last autumn, though of course she did not know to call it that. A storm was standing far out over the summer sea, a wall of purple-black cloud with lightning walking inside it, and the black hatchling rose suddenly from the parapet and spread himself against it. And he was the same colour as the storm, exactly, so that for a moment he did not look like a creature in front of the sky, but like a hole in it, a dragon-shaped absence into which the world could fall. Daenys heard herself say the word before she knew she had thought it.
Valyrian.
It was an old name, out of the oldest lists, one of the gods the first Valyrians had worshipped before they learned to worship themselves. The black turned his head at the sound, held her eyes, and made, low in the furnace of his chest, a sound she had never heard from him or any dragon. Not a growl, not a hiss, but a long, slow, rolling note, like a mountain talking in its sleep. From that night, when the keepers called the name, he answered to it. He never answered to them for anything else. The Festival of the Flames came at the turn of that autumn, as it came every year. 14 days of rites and games and feasting, one day for each of the fires that had made the freehold, and the whole of Valyria burned with light for the length of it. Daenys walked the festival streets with her family on the first night, as she had every year of her life, and this is what the last festival looked like, in the memories she would carry to the end of her days. Torches of green sorcerous flame lining the triumphal way for 3 miles, so that the great road of fused stone ran like a river of emerald from the harbour to the temple district. Whole oxen and lambs and peacocks turning over fire pits at every crossing, the fat hissing, the air one solid fragrance of roasting meat and honey wine, and the crushed flowers that the crowds threw by the basketful. Pyromancers on floating platforms making phoenixes and krakens, and burning ships of coloured fire above the squares while children screamed with joy. The temple steps crowded with the priests of 100 gods. Valyria kept all gods, believed in few, feared none, chanting in tongues from every land the dragon's shadow touched. Slaves in their tens of thousands, threading the crowds with trays and torches and litters, so woven into the fabric of every scene that the eye of the freehold did not see them at all, as the eye does not see air. And Daenys, who counted things, counting them despite herself, and stopping as she always stopped, because the number had no top. And over it all the lords of Valyria in the sky. It was the custom of the first night that the dragon lords flew, every house, every beast that would bear a rider, and the fires of the city turned their bellies to jewels, and the crowds in their hundreds of thousands looked up at the storm of wings and did not cower but cheered, because the terror of the world was their terror, the whip hand of the earth was their hand, and every soul in those streets down to the meanest dock porter owned some sliver of the pride of it. That was the deep sorcery of Valyria, deeper than the fire magic, deeper than the blood arts. It had convinced even those it stood upon that its weight was glory. The Targaryens flew in their appointed place, well back in the great procession, third hill among the third hill houses. Daenys rode that night behind her father on patient Maraxes, her arms around his waist, and watched the freehold turn beneath them, 10,000 towers full of light, the harbour a field of stars, the 14 flames standing around it all in a ring of dim red crowns. And she was, that night, purely and completely happy in the last unbroken hour of her life, though the hour did not announce itself, for the great hours never do. It was on the 5th night of the festival, the night of the rite of the deep fires, that the small wrong thing happened. The rite was old past reckoning. The fire priests of the 14 went down into the temple vaults, where shafts ran toward the living rock, and read the year's fortune in the behaviour of the deep flame. And every year in living memory, and in the memory of the archives, the reading had been the same. The fires are content, the freehold is favoured, build, conquer, prosper. The reading was proclaimed from the temple steps at midnight to a crowd of 250,000, and it was, everyone agreed, a lovely piece of theatre, the way a thing can only be theatre when its outcome has been certain for 1,000 years. That year, the priests came up from the vaults late, only a little late. The midnight horns had barely finished before the eldest of them appeared on the steps, and the proclamation, when it came, was the proclamation it had always been, word for ancient word. The crowd roared. The green torches blazed, the festival rolled on into its 6th day, and no chronicle in the freehold recorded that anything at all had occurred. But Daenys had been standing near the front of the crowd with Gaiman, close enough to see the eldest priest's face, and she was a girl who watched faces the way she counted ships. And what she saw, in the moment before the old man raised his arms and gave the freehold its immemorial good news, was this. He glanced back once at the mouth of the vault behind him, quickly, the way a man glances back at a room where he has left something he does not understand. Then the arms went up and the words rolled out, and Valyria cheered. Gaiman leaned in at her ear, grinning, festival flushed.
You've got your listening look. What is it? Count something interesting?
Daenys looked at the priest a moment longer. Old man, gold robes, arms spread over the greatest city the world had ever made, or would ever make.
No, nothing.
8 nights later, she dreamed. It began with the sound. Not the sound of the 14 flames, that low, familiar mutter, the pulse in the stone that every child of Valyria slept inside like a second heartbeat. This was that sound, but wrong. It was the pulse of the mountains as it might sound if the sleeper were waking, if the heart were failing. A long, grinding, rising groan, as if the world itself had drawn a breath and could not decide whether to scream. Daenys stood. In the dream, she was simply standing, arrived from nowhere, the way dreams arrive, on the terrace of her father's manse. It was full day. It was also, at the same time and without contradiction, deep night. The sun stood in the sky and gave no light, a coin of dull tin behind a caul of brown air. Below her, the harbour lay in its great curve, and the ships were burning. Not some ships, all of them. 400, 500, 1,000 hulls, every quay, every mast, one single sheet of flame from headland to headland, and the sea itself was moving in a way no sea moves, heaping, sliding sideways, pulling back from the land like a lip pulling back from teeth, and where it withdrew, the harbour floor lay naked, black mud and ancient wrecks and 10,000 silver fish flapping, and the fire from the ships ran out across the wet mud in ribbons, as if even the memory of water had become something that could burn. She tried to look away, and the dream turned her head for her, gently, like a mother's hand toward the mountains. The 14 flames were opening. That was the only word her mind could shape. Not erupting. She had no proper image then, for what erupting meant, no one living did. Opening, the way a wound opens, the way a mouth opens. The nearest of the peaks, the one whose plume she had seen from her bedroom window every morning of her life, had split from crown to root, and the split was widening as she watched, with a slowness that was worse than speed, and the light that came out of the split was not the light of any fire in the world above. It was the deep flame. It was what the priests went down their shafts to read. It had never asked to be read. It stood up out of the broken mountain in a column that went up and up and up, until it bent against the roof of the sky, and it made a sound that was not sound, a pressure, a hand of air, and the hand came across the lands of the long summer flattening forests, like grass, and reached the city, and every tower Daenys had ever failed to count went down at once on it. She saw it in pieces, because the dream came in pieces, shattered out of every order but the order of grief. She saw the triumphal way, its 3 miles of fused stone that no force could break, breaking, folding up in waves like a shaken carpet, and the crowds on it, tiny at this distance, a spilled ant nest, running in every direction and no direction, because there was no direction. Doors of the great manses vomiting people into streets that were already rivers of dust. A wall carved with 1,000 years of sphinxes and heroes, leaning out over a fleeing crowd with something like tenderness before it came down. She saw the first hill fall on the second hill. She saw the sea come back. It came back the way it had gone, sideways and heaped and wrong, but higher now, higher than the harbour towers. A moving cliff of black water with ships still burning on its face like lamps carried by a wave of mourners. And it walked into the drowning city and put out 10,000 fires and lit nothing else ever again. And the dragons, oh the dragons. They rose from every hill as the mountains opened. Hundreds, the whole storm of them, every wing in the freehold clawing for height, and for one moment the dream let her hope. Because they were dragons. They were fire made flesh. Fire could not unmake them, everyone knew. Everyone had always known. And then the burning air came up beneath them from the opened earth, hotter than any fire that flesh had ever been asked to be, and the storm of wings became a storm of falling. She saw a great gold beast, big as a first hill palace, fold in the air like paper in a lamp flame. She saw two dragons collide blind in the ash and go down tangled. She heard them. That was the thing the dream would not spare her, the thing she would wake with, the thing that would live in her all her life behind a door. She learned never to open in company. The sound of dragons dying, not roaring, not raging, but screaming, in voices horribly, unbearably like the voices of children, hundreds of children, high and thin and asking, while the sky ate them. The dream had no flaw. She fell through scene after scene, each one truer than the last. A slave woman in the undermines, in the tunnels beneath the 14 flames, in the last instant of the deep dark, before the dark turned white. She did not look afraid. She looked like a woman hearing a door unlocked. A fire priest, the old one, the one from the temple steps, on his knees in his vault, hands over his ears, weeping, and the deep flame rising past his reading shaft in a tide. Her mother's garden, the lemon trees standing whole and untouched and perfectly silent under falling grey snow that was not snow, drifted a foot deep, 2 feet, burying the fire poppies, and no one would ever walk there again. A child's voice somewhere in the brown air, calling one word over and over, a name, its mother's name or its god's, until the air itself burned the word away. And time in the dream was broken. She understood that now she was seeing the end and the year before the end, and the moment after all. Endings, all at once and out of every order, and beneath the ruin, beneath the water, beneath the ash, something spoke to her. Not in words. Nothing so kind as words. It was the voice of the thing that had been muttering under Valyria for 5,000 years, the pulse in the stone, the sleeping heart, and what it said, what it had always been saying, in the floors and the basins and the bones of every soul who had ever loved that city, was simply, I am not sleeping, I am counting. And Daenys Targaryen, who counted things, understood at last what her whole strange watching life had been for, and the understanding was a mercy and an atrocity in one, and she stood on the terrace of her father's house in the noon-coloured dark, with the whole world dying around her in fire and water and grey snow. And the last thing the dream showed her, the very last, held back like a blade held back, was the far parapet of the terrace, where through all of it, through the fall of the towers and the death song of the dragons, a black shape had been sitting motionless, watching her. Balerion opened his wings against the burning sky. And the sky and the dragon were the same colour, so that it seemed the darkness itself had spread its wings, and would now decide what to save. "Fly!" said the voice that was not a voice. And it was not the mountain's voice now. It was smaller, nearer. It might almost have been her own. "Fly. You are already late. You have been late for years." She woke on the floor. She had no memory of leaving the bed. She was on the cold stone in the grey before dawn, with her limbs tangled in a sheet soaked through with sweat, and her throat was raw, which meant she had been screaming, though the manse around her was silent, so perhaps she had screamed only in the country she had just fled. Her heart was hitting her ribs so hard she could see the pulse of it in her vision. For a long moment she did not know where she was, or when, or whether the floor beneath her hands could be trusted to remain a floor. Then the tremor came up through the stone, the old familiar mutter of the 14 flames, the pulse of home, the sound she had slept inside all her life. Daenys crawled away from it, and was sick in the corner of her room. Afterwards she sat against the wall with her knees against her chest, shaking while the window greyed toward morning, and did what she had always done with the world. She tried to count it, item by item. The dream was already tearing, the way dreams tear, whole provinces of it crumbling as she reached for them. But what remained did not fade like dream stuff. What remained sat in her mind with edges, with weight. with the terrible, unarguable there-ness of memory, as if she were not a girl recalling a nightmare, but a woman recalling something she had survived. The sea pulling back from the land, the mountain opening from crown to root, the grey snow in her mother's garden, the screaming that was like children. I am not sleeping, I am counting. Her window faced east, toward the peaks. All her life she had loved that window. Now she made herself stand, on legs that did not want her weight, and go to it, and look, because she was Daenys Targaryen's daughter, and she would not begin whatever this was by refusing to look. The 14 flames stood in the dawn where they had always stood, dim red crowns going rose gold as the light came, wearing their little feathers of smoke. Beautiful, eternal. Below them, the city was waking. She could hear the first carts on the stone, a fisherman's horn in the harbour, somewhere a slave chorus singing the sun up in the old mode, the way they had sung it for 100 generations and would sing it, everyone knew, for 100 more. Daenys stood at the window in the wreckage of her 16th year and watched the most powerful civilization in the history of the world pour itself another ordinary day, and heard herself whisper it, to the glass, to the peaks, to no one. You're all already dead. And then she pressed both hands over her mouth, because saying it aloud had made it real, and began at last to cry. She did not tell him that morning. That was the first thing Daenys learned about carrying the end of the world. It is possible to carry it through an ordinary breakfast. It is possible to sit at your mother's table with your hands folded while the fruit is served, and answer that you slept poorly, only that a poor night, and watch your family eat figs in a patch of morning sun in a house that you have seen buried under grey snow. It is possible because the alternative, opening your mouth and letting the thing out into the sunlight, is a door that, once passed, can never be repassed, and some animal wisdom in her understood that and made her wait. She waited 3 days. For 3 days, she told herself the sensible things. It was a nightmare. The festival had overtired her. She'd eaten spiced eel too late in the evening. Girls of 6 and 10 had vivid dreams. Everyone said so. Her scepter of numbers had said so. Valyria had no scepters, but her mind was already fraying at its edges, reaching for any voice of any authority that would tell her she was only a girl, and the world was only the world. For 3 days she avoided the east windows. For 3 days she did not go to the terrace because Balerion was on the terrace, and she found she could not yet look at him. On the 3rd night she dreamed it again. Not the whole of it. A single room of the vast burning house of the first dream. The harbour, the sea pulling back, the naked black mud and the silver fish. And this time, small and sharp and new, a detail that had not been there before. A ship at the farthest quay, sails already spread. Black sails on a black hull, pulling out ahead of the fire with the wind of the world's ending at its back. On its deck, tiny with distance, a knot of silver-haired figures stood looking back at the city. One of them was herself. She woke, and it was still deep night, and she did not go back to sleep. She sat by her cold lamp until the greying of the window, and by the time the manse woke, she was no longer asking herself whether the dream was true. Some tide had turned in her during the dark hours, quietly and completely, the way tides turn. The question that remained was worse. Who do I tell, and what happens to us when I do? Because she had grown up on the 3rd hill, and she was her father's daughter, and even in the middle of her terror, the cold Targaryen ledger-keeping part of her mind could write out the accounting. A lesser house, a daughter, a girl, a strange girl, everyone said so. A dream. In Valyria, where dreamers were as common as fire priests and about as much heeded, where half the mummers' comedies had a mad profit in them for the crowds to jeer, she could see the assembly's faces, she could hear the laughter running down the hills like water, first hill to second to third, until it pooled around her father's careful lifetime of work and dissolved it. Enar Doomcrier, Enar of the nightmares, the house that ran from a girl's bad dream. She could destroy House Targaryen by speaking. She could destroy it more completely by staying silent. On the 4th morning, she went to the library before dawn because she wanted the one room where she had always been most herself, and she took down the oldest histories of the freehold and read for 4 hours with a fixed and furious attention. The Giscari Wars, the taming of the fires, the founding annals, hunting for the thing she already knew she would not find, any record anywhere in 5,000 years of the mountains being anything but the source of all gifts. The histories were a wall of triumph without a single crack in it. That, she thought suddenly, with a clarity that frightened her, is what my great-grandmother meant. A beast that has forgotten it has a body, all head, all fire, and no memory at all of pain, because it had never yet been hurt, and so it had concluded, with perfect logic and perfect madness, that it could not be. She was still sitting there, the annals open and unseen before her, when her father came in. He had come for a trade ledger. He was dressed for the harbour offices. He was entirely inside the ordinary day. He saw his daughter at the great table in the dawn light and began some mild remark about early birds, and then he saw her face, and stopped, and Daenys watched the ordinary day fall away from him like a dropped cloak. He shut the door behind him.
Daenys, what has happened?
And the door being shut, and his voice being that voice, the library voice, the night voice, the voice that had always, always listened. The 3 days broke in her at once, and she said it.
Father, I have to tell you a dream.
He did not believe her. It was essential, ever afterward, to the way Daenys understood her father, to the way she loved him, that he did not believe her, not that morning, not for many mornings. Daenys Targaryen was not a mystic. He was a man of ledgers and cargoes and the patient arithmetic of hills. And his first thought, hearing his white-faced daughter describe the death of the world, was not for the world at all. It was for her. He listened without once interrupting, which was his gift. She told it badly. She heard herself telling it badly, the words coming out crooked and insufficient. The sea went backward, the mountain opened, the snow was grey. Language itself seemed a currency too small for the purchase, and twice she stopped in sheer frustration, hands clenched, the words breaking apart on her. That's not it. The words are wrong. It wasn't like anything. It was... And he waited, and she tried again. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he came around the table and sat beside her and took her hands, cold, both of them noticed his were no warmer, and searched her face and spoke gently.
You had a fever in the spring. Do you remember? You dreamed the harbour froze, and your mother was a white bird. You told me the morning after, and by supper you were laughing at it. The festival was long. You are tired in some way we haven't seen. I'll have Malario look at you. Quietly. No one need know. Sweetling, the mountains have burned and smoked and shivered since before our house had a name. This is what it is to live in Valyria. Every child of the freehold has dreamed fire.
Have you?
The question caught him. She saw it catch.
Have I what?
Have you ever, in your whole life, dreamed that? Because I have dreamed fire, Father. I dreamed the kitchen's burning when I was 9 and woke crying and Mother sat with me. I know what a nightmare is. I know what it weighs. It weighs nothing by noon. This is 4 days old, and it weighs more every morning. I am not telling you I had a dream about the doom of our city. I am telling you I remember it. The way I remember the festival, the way I will remember this room. It has happened, Father. It is only that it hasn't happened yet.
She had turned her hands in his as she spoke and gripped them. The words hung in the library. Later, Einar would tell her, much later, on the far side of everything when they could speak of it, that it was that sentence, crooked and impossible, that had put the first crack in him. It has happened. It is only that it hasn't happened yet. Because he was a man who had listened to liars all his life in the trade halls, and to the honestly mistaken, which was a different music, and to the frightened, which was different again, and what was sitting in front of him fit none of the three. His daughter did not sound like a girl asking to be comforted out of a terror. She sounded, he had no better word for it, and hated the one he had, like a witness. But a crack is not a fall. He was 30 years a lord of the freehold. He sent for Malario, the maester of the house, who found the young lady sound of body, if sleepless. He watched her for a fortnight at meals in the gardens, with an attention she felt like sunlight and pretended not to notice. He made, without telling her, certain quiet inquiries at the temple district, and learned nothing, save that a junior fire priest of his acquaintance had grown strangely reluctant this season to discuss the rite of the deep fires at all, and had changed the subject with a laugh that had no laughter in it. And the dreams kept coming. Not every night. That would almost have been kinder. A girl who screamed every night could be called ill, and illness was a door back to the ordinary world. It was every 8th night, every 12th, without pattern, long enough between for the household to exhale, never long enough to forget. And each one brought back some new, small, deadly specific. The birds this time, all the birds of the lands of the long summer, rising at once, one vast wing of birds fleeing north days before the mountains opened, a sky gone strange and silent. Another night, the wells of the lower city turning warm, and no one thinking anything of it. Another, the harbour on the last morning, and the ship's masters remarking to one another about the tide, which had come in wrong, too far and too fast, and gone out wrong too, and laughing about it and loading their cargoes. She began to write them down. That was Enar's suggestion, made half as a father's therapy, and half, though he did not admit this to himself for months, as a merchant's habit, because Daenys Targaryen recorded things that might later matter. She took an unused ledger from the library, and on its first page, in her small exact hand, she wrote, "Signs and portents as they have been shown to me, set down so that they may be tested against the world. And if a single act can be said to save a bloodline, a dynasty, 300 years of kings, the long red thread that leads through Aegon and his sisters and the field of fire all the way down the centuries to a girl with dragons on a far Dothraki plain, it was perhaps that one, a frightened 16-year-old, disbelieved and half disbelieving herself, opening a book and picking up a pen and writing the world's ending down in columns like an inventory. Because the tests began to come back true. It was the wells that did it. In the coldest week of that winter, word ran around the lower city, a curiosity, a marvel for the market crowds, that the deep wells of the harbour district had gone warm. Bathhouse warm in midwinter, for the first time in any record the water guilds kept. The freehold was delighted. Free hot water. The gods loved Valyria. The poets made verses. Daenys Targaryen stood in his library with his daughter's ledger open to a page written in her small, exact hand, 4 months earlier. The wells of the lower city will turn warm, and no one will think anything of it. And read the line perhaps 50 times, and then sat down in his chair like a man whose legs had been taken from under him, and put his face in his hands, and did not move for the better part of an hour. Daenys found him there. She did not say anything. She sat down across the table, in her place, the lamp between them, the way it had been on all the nights of her childhood. At last he raised his head, and Daenys saw that her father had aged, truly visibly in an afternoon, and that the thing that had aged him was not fear, not yet. It was arithmetic. He was a man of ledgers, and he had just watched a column sum itself, and the sum was every soul on 14 hills. He spoke slowly, each word set down like a weight, looking at his hands, and his voice caught once at the end of it, the first time in her life she had heard it do so.
If it is true, then everything I have built my life around is a tomb. Our house, our standing, our name in the assembly, the work of my father and his, all of it is furniture in a tomb. And I have spent 30 years polishing it. And if I act on it, if I believe you, publicly, with everything, and you are wrong, then I have burned that same work on the word of a dream, and our name becomes a jest for 100 years, and your brother inherits ash of a different kind, and you... They will not be gentle about you, Daenys. Do you understand me? Whatever else comes, they will not be gentle.
I know what they'll call me. I've heard the Mummers shows too, Father.
She was surprised how level it came out.
And still, you'd have me stand up with this.
No, I'd have you live. You, Mother, Gaiman, Damien, the household. I have stopped caring, I think, whether anyone stands up, whether anyone believes it, whether my name is a jest for 1,000 years. Let them laugh until the sky falls on them. I've seen what happens to the people who laugh, Father. I see it every 8th night. I have stopped wanting to be believed. I only want to not watch it happen to you.
Her voice had shaken on it, because this was the thing she had rehearsed alone on the terrace 100 times, and it came out nothing like the rehearsals. The last of it said quietly, which made it worse. The lamp hissed. Under the floor, under the hill, under the city, the old pulse muttered in the stone, patient as ever, counting.
1 year. Give me 1 year. If your book keeps proving true, if the world keeps answering it, then I will do what no lord of the freehold has done in the whole history of the freehold. I will believe a dream against Valyria. But hear me, daughter. If we walk down this road, we walk it to its end. There is no halfway to the end of the world.
He reached across the table and closed her small hand in both of his as he said it, and what was in his face was terrible because it was the beginning of belief, and belief for a man who had seen what she had written was another word for grief.
No, there isn't.
They were the two most alone people in Valyria that night, in the lamplight, in the library, in the vast, warm, indifferent, glittering city. It would be a long time before either of them was ever less alone again. The year turned, and the book kept proving true. Small things. The dream dealt mostly in small things, which Daenys came to understand was the crueler way, because small things could always be explained. A season of strange tides, logged and laughed off, a blight of dead fish along the western strands, blamed on Giscari bilge. Tremors, no worse than 100 forgotten tremors, save that Daenys' ledger had dated 3 of them to the month, and Enar had watched her write the entries with his own eyes, and stood in his counting room when the floor whispered on the appointed days, and felt each one pass through him like a verdict. The family was told that spring, in the library, with the doors barred. Valyria, Gaiman, Damien. It went as badly as Daenys had feared, and worse than Enar had allowed himself to imagine. Her mother heard it out in a stillness more frightening than any storm, and then rose and said in a voice like the edge of a knife that she had spent 20 years defending this family from every whisper on 3 hills, and would not see it feed itself to the mummers by its own hand. That she loved her daughter, that her daughter was ill in some way the maesters had missed, and that what Daenys needed was rest and quiet and marriage, not a father who had decided to go mad alongside her out of tenderness. She did not weep until she was nearly at the door. Then she wept in fury, and Daenys learned that night that her mother's fury had been, all along, only the armor her fear wore, and that of everyone in the household, it was Valyria, quick, sharp, worldly Valyria, who believed the dream first in the animal marrow of her, and fought it hardest and longest precisely because she believed it, because some things cannot be permitted to be true. Damien called it moon sickness, then madness, then, as the months ran on and the ledger kept filling and his brother kept quietly liquidating cargo contracts, betrayal. There were nights of shouting behind the library doors that the household pretended not to hear. And Gaiman came to her terrace the night after the telling, and stood beside her at the parapet in an uncharacteristic silence, looking out at the harbour lights with his jaw set, and Daenys waited for the laugh, the golden deflecting laugh that met everything, and it did not come. What came at last was...
The wells!
Huh? What?
The warm wells, this winter. Everyone was so pleased. Vagon wouldn't drink from the lower cisterns after that week. Flew fresh water up from the hill springs. Mad extravagance. The keepers thought he'd gone strange. And the black.
He had turned to look at her as he spoke, and she saw with a shock that her glorious brother was afraid. not of her, and not exactly of the dream, but of a thing he had noticed on his own and had been carrying alone, waiting to see if anyone else would say it. He had stopped on the word.
Say it.
Balerion hasn't slept in the low cavern since the festival. The keepers can't drive him down. He sleeps on the open terrace, in the rain, in the wind, facing the mountains. A year, Daenys. He's slept a year with his eyes toward the 14. Everyone in this family has been asking whether we believe you. Nobody thought to ask the dragons.
He let out a breath that shook at its end, and took her hand then, her golden brother, on the dark terrace, and held it the way he had when she was 5 and the festival crowds had frightened her.
Gaiman.
I'm with you. Whatever it costs. I want you to hear it from me plainly, once, so you can keep it. I'm with you, and I will be with you at the end of it, whichever end it is.
He kept that promise all his life. Of everything Daemon Targaryen would come to be called, and men would call him the Glorious in time, on the far Black Island, and hang 100 honors on him. Daenys alone knew the first and truest of his titles, the one no chronicle recorded, the first man in Valyria who chose to believe her. Aenar gave the freehold its chance to live on the 9th day of the 9th moon, in the Hall of the 40, before the assembled first families of Valyria, 1 year almost to the night from the lamplit bargain in the library. Daenys was present. She had insisted. He had refused.
You are about to stake our house on my dreams, and you would leave the dreamer home?
And it was Valyria of all people who had ended it.
Take her. Let them see the girl is no gibbering thing. It is the only argument that cannot be laughed at.
So Daenys stood at the foot of the Targaryen bench in a gown of black and red, 17 years old, and watched her father walk out alone onto the speaker's floor of the most powerful room in the world. The Hall of the 40 was old even by the measure of Valyria, a vault of fused black stone so vast that clouds of incense hung in its upper darkness like weather, its walls ringed with the high benches of the Dragon Lord houses, tier over tier, first hill above second above third. The floor of the hall was a single polished disc of frozen fire, dragon glass streaked with veins of dull red, and it was said that the deep flame itself had been drawn up to make it in the elder days, so that every lord who spoke in Valyria's councils stood upon a piece of the fires that had made her. 5,000 years of empire had been argued into being on that floor. It had heard the partition of Geese, the doom of Royn, the division of half the world. It had never once heard what it was about to hear. They gave Aenar of the Third Hill the floor with the mild, collective courtesy the great reserve for the sound, and Daenys counting faces along the first hill benches as her father's steps rang across the dragonglass, understood, with a sensation like cold water, the true size of what he was carrying toward them. Lords whose single dragons outweighed her house's 5 together. Ladies whose ancestors had broken nations the way a cook breaks eggs, whose family memories ran back unbroken to the shepherds and the first fires. Faces of every caste, bored, curious, kindly, keen. And under all of them, floor deep, wall deep, 5,000 years deep, the same serene foundation. Nothing under the sun can be a danger to us, for we are the danger under the sun. Her father meant to stand on that foundation and tell them it was going to open beneath their feet. He began quietly, and he began with trade. With what he knew, with the language of the hall, the strange tides logged by the harbour masters 4 seasons running, the warm wells, the fish kills, the tremor records of the water guilds set against the records of a century, the small anomalies compounding like interest, and the benches listened with mild attention, expecting this to become a petition about port levies. And then Aenar Targaryen squared his shoulders, and Daenys saw him do the thing she would remember above all the rest, the small tremendous thing. He looked once across the hall to where she stood, not for reassurance, in apology and in salute, and stepped off the foundation of the world.
My lords, I am not here about the tides. I am here because these signs were written down in my house before the world produced them, each one dated. In a ledger I will lay before any lord who asks, written by my daughter, who has been shown what they are the beginning of. The 14 flames are going to open. Not smoke, not shiver. Open, all of them together. On a day I cannot give you, in a year I cannot give you. The peninsula will break. The sea will come in where Valyria stood. And every soul and every dragon within 500 miles of this floor will die between 1 hour and the next. Unless this freehold, which has mastered everything under the sky, finds the humility to master its own certainty and look down at what it is standing on and prepare.
The stillness in the hall had changed quality by the time he finished. For 3 heartbeats, the Hall of the 40 was as silent as it had ever been in 5,000 years. Then it laughed. It did not laugh all at once, and it did not all laugh. That, too, Daenys counted, and kept. It began somewhere on the second tier as a single incredulous bark, and caught and ran the benches like fire in dry grass, tier to tier, a rising rolling storm of it, lords slapping the stone, ladies hiding smiles behind jeweled hands, the incense clouds above shivering with it, the mirth of the masters of the world, boundless and golden and utterly without malice toward the small, careful man on the floor, which was the worst of it, because malice can be fought. They were not angry. One is not angry at a mummer's mad prophet. Somewhere above her, a young lord was gasping to his neighbour, "The wells. Gods, he's brought us the warm wells." And the neighbour, "Third Hill weather witching. They'll be reading goat entrails on the docks by winter." Not all laughed. Daenys marked the ones who didn't. Old Lord Baleris of the First Hill sat gravely through it with his chin on his fist, watching Enar with the expression of a man watching a friend bleed. A handful of others, 3, 4, 5 faces down the tiers, had gone very still in the particular way of people who have each, privately, in the dark of some recent night, noticed one small wrong thing of their own, and told no one. The Lady Sayalora of House Violaros, whose word moved the First Hill, finally raised one ringed hand, and the storm of mirth banked itself to hear her, and she spoke not cruelly, graciously, which cut deeper, the sentence that Daenys would hear again on the last night of her life and on many nights between.
My Lord of Targaryen, this hall has heard the freehold through the Giscari Wars, 5 of them. Through the doom we ourselves delivered upon Royne. Through plague, through rebellion, through the burning years. Valyria has buried every enemy the world has sent against her. And the world has by now, I think, run out of enemies to send. The mountains are our mothers, my lord. They gave us the dragons. They gave us the fire. They have grumbled at their work for 50 centuries, as any laborer grumbles. And now the freehold is asked to, what was the word? Prepare. To pack up the seat of the world on the word of a sleeping girl child. Valyria does not fear nightmares, my Lord of Targaryen. Valyria is the nightmare. Ask the rest of the world.
A ripple of warm laughter had run the benches as she spoke, and her gaze, at the last, found Daenys at the foot of the benches, and it was not unkind, and it was 10,000 miles away. The hall roared its approval, benches and blood and 5,000 years of it, and Daenys, standing very straight in black and red, watched her father's back and saw the moment the last patience went out of it. He did not shout. Ever afterward, that was the detail the mockers got wrong in the wine sinks and the mummers' versions in the year that followed. They played Enar the Exile raving, arms flailing, spittle flying, because that is how the comedies write a doom crier. What the Hall of the 40 actually saw was worse, and some part of it knew so even as it laughed, and that was why the laughing stopped. Einar Targaryen waited until the roar had spent itself. He looked slowly around the tiers, First Hill, second, third, the whole ringed might of the world, with an expression Daenys had never seen on him, and it took her a moment to name it, and then she did, and her blood went cold because she had seen it before after all. Once, on the face of a fire priest, in a vault, in a dream. It was the face of a man watching people already dead. His quiet when he spoke carried to the topmost tier because the hall had gone silent to receive it without knowing why.
I hear you. I've heard this hall all my life. My fathers heard it for 12 generations, and were proud to be heard in it in their turn. And I was proud, and my lady wife will tell you I have spent 30 years working to be heard in it a little louder. So believe me when I say I know exactly what I have spent tonight, and what I bought with it, and that I would spend it again. You are right, Lady Salora. Valyria has buried every enemy under the sun. And so you have all concluded. The conclusion is beneath your feet. It is built into the floor of this hall. But nothing remains which can kill you. My lords, I stood where you sit and believed it too. But I have had a year to read one small book, and I will tell you the one thing it has taught me, and then I am done, and you may laugh me down the hills and be free of House Targaryen forever. Your enemies were never under the sun.
He let it stand. Somewhere in the upper dark, incense drifted through a shaft of lamplight like grey snow.
My Lord of Targaryen.
I do not know the hour. I do not know the day or the year, or by what hand or law or ancient anger the deep fires have been set counting. My daughter does not know. If the gods were kind, they would have sent the dream to a first hill lord with 40 dragons, and this hall would already be moving. They sent it to us, and so it comes to you, sounding small, and you are the masters of the world, and the masters of the world do not stoop to small doors. So be it. But mark this, all of you, mark it. I ask nothing else of Valyria now, but that it remember. You were warned. In this hall, on this night, on this floor of frozen fire, one house stood before you and told you the mountains had turned. And on the day it comes, when the sea runs backward out of the harbor, and the wells boil, and the birds go up from the lands of the long summer in one wing and do not come back, you will have, between that hour and the fire, just time enough to remember this ugly little third hill lord and his sleeping girl child. I hope with all my heart that you spend it getting your children to the ships. But I have seen the accounting, my lords. You will spend it being right.